The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Ski Sundown in nearby New Hartford, Connecticut, offering night skiing until 10 on 16 groomed and lighted trails. Ticket and rental information at skisundown.com. Winter made better. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Window World of Western Mass, a local family business with experienced craftsmen offering skylights, siding, gutters, and doors. WindowWorldofWesternMA.com.
Welcome to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith.
And I'm Monty Belmonte. Today may be the beginning of school vacation week, but sorry, not sorry, we're going back to school.
Especially since we're talking about parts of America's past you probably missed. We'll talk with three historians, Clark University Professor Uzman Power Green, about two too often forgotten black women, one of whom is a 19th century opera singer, and one who you can find inside your passport.
We'll talk with UMass doctoral candidate, the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, Erica Slocum, about the importance of oral history.
But we'll start with a professor who's one of the first fellows in the Slavery North initiative. And just as a content warning, our conversation does touch on historical instances of physical and sexual violence.
Tomorrow night on Zoom, Historic Northampton will feature a talk by our next guest titled Of Bondage and Isolation, Meditations on the Lives of Black Women Enslaved in the Pioneer Valley, which takes a look at women enslaved in Northampton by names you might recognize from street signs and possibly their descendants still living in the city today.
Joining us now is the person giving that talk, Professor Jennifer DeClue. Jennifer DeClue is an associate professor in the program for the study of women and gender at Smith College. She is a queer studies scholar who specializes in black feminism, gender and chattel slavery, queer of color critique, film studies, popular culture, and the avant-garde. She earned her doctorate in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California, has been teaching at Smith College since 2015.
Her scholarship's been published in the anthologies No Tea, No Shade, and Sisters in the Life, and in The Black Scholar. Her book, Visitation, The Conjure Work of Black Feminist Avant-Garde Cinema, won the Duke University Press Scholar of Color First Book Award. She's also one of the 2024-25 Fellows for Slavery North, which we'll hear about a little bit later in the week.
How did you come to this topic, which is part of your Slavery North work too, right?
That's right. Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me on.
Sure.
It is such a pleasure to be in this room with you. My thinking about slavery began when I was in graduate school. I have a degree in American Studies and Ethnicity from USC. I studied film, gender, and African American studies. And part of the work that I did there was thinking about women enslaved. What I learned was that the field of study about slavery really focused on men. Men enslaved were the people who were the focus of every analysis of slavery until Black women scholars started studying women's experiences of slavery. And that wasn't until the 70s, most famously with Angela Davis's article Reflections on the Role of Black Women in the Community of Slaves, published in 1971. And, Deborah Gray White, Ain't I a Woman, and Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and American Grammar Book are all published in the 80s. They think about what it was like to be a Black woman enslaved. And a terrible feature of that experience was rape. And so not thinking about women enslaved didn't attend to the fact that Black women were raped, and that was a part of being an enslaved person. And so that is what led me into thinking about slavery. For this project, it was living in Northampton and feeling the presence of a history that was beneath the history of abolition in the town. It was celebrated history of the Northampton Association for Education and Industry. Sojourner Truth was here. Frederick Douglass was here. William Lord Garrison was here. Famous abolitionists were here. But, standing like in front of City Hall and looking at 1654 up there on the City Hall sort of facade. And I was like, how is it that a town is older than the country? What happened in 1654 here?
What can you tell us about some individuals that were either enslaved who lived here or the people who were enslaving them that are from here? And like Khalees and I mentioned in the intro, these are some names that still loom large in the city of Northampton.
Certainly Jonathan Edwards is one of those figures. There's a lot of history of strict congregational religion that is quite pious. And also the contradiction with Edwards is that, he was warning the congregation about the state of their souls while he was enslaving people. He had at least 5 people enslaved. The person who gets talked most about is Venus, because this is the first person that he purchased in 1731. He traveled to Newport, Rhode Island, and purchased Venus when she was 14 years old and brought her back to Northampton. Venus drops out of the record around 1736, and a woman named Leah comes into the record through her baptism in the first church in Northampton. So it's unclear what happened. Did Venus die, or was she sold away, or did Venus become Leah through baptism, which could have happened? And so, Jonathan Edwards owned several people while he was a minister at the first church.
From what I recollect, it is President's Day, a lot of the founding fathers had aspirational views about what humanity could be, and at the same time decided to still own human beings. Was Jonathan Edwards in that same camp where he wrestled with the actual morality of slavery while actually doing nothing about his own personal life in response to it?
Or was it just never questioned?
What's interesting, there's a scholar named Kenneth Menkema who discovered a note written by Jonathan Edwards that defended slavery. Some members of his congregation felt that it was contradictory to own slaves and be a minister. And he was prompted to write a defense of slavery in that as long as slavers treated enslaved people well, it was okay to own slaves. And part of treating them well was baptizing them and saving their souls, making them Christians. The other thing was that he accused the church members of being hypocrites themselves because they were participating in slavery through their products that they liked, like cotton and molasses and rum. And so he said, how dare you accuse me of being a hypocrite? Actually, you're more cruel because you're just enjoying the benefits of Southern slave labor. And I'm actually, saving their souls.
We're speaking with Khalees is speechless, and I think rightly so. And I think that legacy continues, and everyone has benefited from the people who were enslaved in the building of this country in one way, shape, or form. And we're speaking with Jen DeClue, who's a professor who will be part of the Slavery North initiative through Historic Northampton in a Zoom conversation about these types of things tomorrow evening. What other ways that are still very obvious to people who casually go in and out about Northampton does the history of slavery in Northampton manifest itself today?
Enslaved people are coming along with the first settlers to the place. So Hawley Street is a street that is named after a famous family from Northampton. And there were a few different families that were famously called the River Gods. These are Puritan settler colonists who, rather than staying in the Massachusetts Bay Colony where the first settlers in the north landed, they wanted to move west. The Pynchons, the Stoddards. If there are any people at Smith College listening, Stoddard Hall is a big hall, and he was the second minister of Northampton. He wasn't a slave owner, but his son John was a slave owner. So Stoddard is one of those. Parsons. In Hadley, the Porter Phelps Huntington home is one of those places. So Phelps was one of those families, but Porter Phelps Huntington, that home exists in Hadley, and they are doing some really good work about talking about the people who were enslaved in that house, and you should go check it out. They give tours and they talk about the history of slavery in Hadley as well.
Other human beings who lived lives that you would like to shine a little bit of a light on to encourage us to be part of this conversation tomorrow?
Yeah. Part of the reason why it's challenging to talk about enslaved people in New England is because so much of what we know about slavery happened in the South, right? And so there's this belief that slavery actually didn't really happen in the North, or else it was milder than in the South. I heard that. And so coming here and feeling the presence of something beneath the story of abolition, I began to ask the question, well, how was it milder? What exactly happened that would give someone the impression that slavery in New England was better than slavery in the South? What I learned is that, like in the South, many people enslaved lived in their own homes. But in New England, people lived in the houses of the people that enslaved them. So they were never off duty, right? Also, there were less enslaved enslaved people, which has been thought of as better, but really produces isolation. Like, who do you talk to? Is there anybody that you live among who knows the language that you know, knows the food, has any traditions, any sort of connection to home? Is that anywhere to be found? At the Port of Phelps Huntington home, there was a woman named Margaret, her daughter Rose and Phyllis, and then Rose had a daughter. Like, those are some of the people who lived in that house that did that labor to think about the sexual lives of adult people living in a town enslaved, in which any sex that you have is criminalized because it's outside of marriage, and they don't recognize the marriage between enslaved people. It's not possible to have legal sex. People still had relationships, they had children, and would be drawn into court on the crime of fornication. Hannah in Northampton and the father of her child, Mingo, were convicted of the crime of fornication and whipped in front of the Pomeroy Tavern and Blacksmith Shop. So Pomeroy is another one of those names, Pomeroy Terrace,
Yes.
right? That was where people were punished. Each were whipped 15 stripes. So Hannah was owned by one family, Mingo was owned by another family, and so those two families co-owned their child. If they decided to sell this baby, then they would have to decide who got the money, and they would need to split it equally. That's what's in the record.
It's important to tell these stories.
It is
I really think it
incredibly
is.
important to
And
tell
I
these
often
stories.
ask myself when I hear people criticizing the telling of these stories, what harm does it matter to you that these stories are coming to light again? It can only really heal, I think. And as we go through an interesting period in this country's history, continuing to focus on these parts of this country's history are really the only way. It's like therapy, man. You've got to
Yeah.
face these things.
It's true.
Or
The last thing I want to say about that is just that that place, the Pomeroy Terrace, was on Main Street. So when you walk down Main Street in Northampton, just know that that same Main Street, that same plot of land is the place where people walked who were enslaved, who were enslavers, where punishment happened, where labor happened, conversions to Christianity happened, and sometimes freedom happened. People did get their freedom at that courthouse. Where it is right now today, the
Yeah.
building's different, but where the church is and where the courthouse is where those two stood from the beginning of Northampton.
What insight have you gotten for this project through your fellowship with Slavery North?
I am so thankful that Slavery North exists. It's incredible. I'm part of the inaugural cohort. Charmaine Nelson is a force helping us think about slavery in the North. So in the U.S. North and Canada, we get to have conversations with other scholars, fellows, artists who are thinking about similar questions from different vantage points. And we get to have a leader in Charmaine who is encouraging us, giving us the space, giving us funding, helping us do this work that oftentimes as scholars we are isolated, and it's really heavy. Sitting down, looking at a document that talks about the punishment of a woman who just had a baby who is going to be stripped bare and whipped in the street. That's really heavy, you know? And so I think of myself as a witness to that. And also there's a way that like doing it with other people helps sort of to lessen the load emotionally.
Your primary work is in like media studies, but has your research for this project shifted any views that you had regarding your main focus of study too?
I think what undergirds all of it is thinking about representation. And so in cinema, we're thinking about visual representation, representation of Blackness or Black womanhood that works to undo stereotypes, even though a lot of times it slips in. And so for this, I'm thinking about representation in a different kind of way. Like, how can we represent a history, lives, experiences that have been really submerged in our cultural imaginary of slavery? It feels disrespectful to not remember what happened to them because they were in New England and not the South.
We're talking about a time where women are inherently seen as less. What have you noticed in the differences of how white women are portrayed, or the majority is portrayed, versus those enslaved, just in terms of their womanhood?
Oftentimes it is women enslavers who are the ones whose diaries we are reading, who talk about the women that they are enslaving. Someone like Sarah Pierpont Edwards, who was Jonathan Edwards' wife, was an active enslaver herself, not just through her husband, but on her own. There's a few letters that are in the archive about her requesting enslaved people to be sent to her. Those letters, those correspondences are oftentimes another place where we can understand what slavery was like or just record the fact of it in their letters or in their diaries. Women who were enslaving have agency and they have a presence. They are the subject in the archive, while enslaved women are the object.
So heavy.
Yeah.
On the whole, how is this project going? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It feels good to be uncovering the material. I grew up in St. Louis. I lived in Los Angeles for a really long time. These are older parts of the country. And, in Missouri's a slave state. There's nothing hidden about it. Los Angeles is a different story. There's missionaries, there's other kinds of histories of violence. Here, it is a place where slavery existed that isn't readily talked about. It was disorienting, and I could feel something that wasn't being talked about. And so this project is really helping me answer the question. If Sojourner Truth, I know she was a slave. I know she walked here. She was free. She was a part of this utopian society, but she was enslaved in New York. Her first language was Dutch because she was enslaved by Dutch people. So she spoke English with a Dutch accent. We're celebrating her as a figure of abolition, but she was enslaved in New York State. I always imagined that she walked from Mississippi to Florence, Massachusetts. Yeah. She did not. She came from New York, right? She was never a Southern enslaved person. And so just putting the timeline together, that was 200 years after Northampton was established, right? There's 200 years of enslavement that happened that we're not talking about. We're only talking about abolition. And so for me, getting the material, finding out the names, understanding what happened on Main Street helps me understand what I was feeling when I would walk down Main Street and feel strange and isolated and in a place that was saying that it was liberal and welcoming me, but I felt something else happening beneath the surface. And so the project, as heavy as it is, helps me make sense of what it was that I was feeling.
Dr. Jennifer DeClue, who is a professor at Smith College, will be hosting a Zoom conversation through historic Northampton tomorrow night, February 18th, 7 p.m. It's part of the Slavery North initiative. It's called Of Bondage and Isolation, Meditations on the Lives of Black Women Enslaved in the Pioneer Valley, moderated by our friend Gina Norton-Smith. It's important to do this kind of history. It really is hard to hear, but again, it's like therapy if we're going to move forward as human beings together. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yay.
We'll hear more about the Slavery North Initiative on tomorrow's show with the director of that initiative, Charmaine Nelson.
Coming up, even more history as we talk with historian Erica Slocum about the importance of oral histories and how that resounds in her current work at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center.
But next, Professor Usman Power Green with a real neat history-based party trick will teach you. Next.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, helping customers make the switch to solar for savings, energy security, and tax incentives. Learn more at northeast-solar.com. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Ski Sundown in nearby New Hartford, Connecticut, offering group, private, or semi-private lessons for all ages and ability levels. Options and details available at skisundown.com. Winter made better.
And he said that he was trapped for 12 hours on a trip abroad, so he read the whole passport. And he knew it. And this is an audience,
that
an
is so
auditorium,
funny.
100 students.
I didn't know there was anybody in the passport.
Yeah.
We have a monthly segment here called The Power of History with Dr. Usman Power Green, professor of history at Clark University in Worcester, with Northampton's own professor of history. But we're quadrupling down on that for Black History Month, and it's Black History Month tips the balance into the second half. We're heading towards Women's History Month, and what we're going to talk about today are two excellent women in Black history. A lot of folks, myself included, have been obsessing over the Kendrick Lamar Super Bowl halftime show, where many people were exposed to a Black art form in a way that maybe they never have been before. But this harkens back to a story from the 1800s that you want to bring our attention to today, Dr. Usman Power Green?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me on. When you're a Black historian, Black History Month is literally every day, everybody.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful opportunity to come on the air and just introduce you all to people who maybe you don't know as much about. about, you mentioned Monty, the sort of massive fame that comes with performing in front of a Super Bowl audience, but also an international audience. And it got me thinking about a pioneering black musician, Matilda Ciceretta Jones, who at the turn of the century was, one of those prominent black women opera singers, everybody, traveled the world, performed in front of presidents, and really epitomizes the ways in which African-American women particularly have been trailblazers beyond just sort of, they used to have minstrel shows back then, other types of performances. We think about the sorrow songs and thinking about, foundations of soul music and these things. It's pretty rare to think about an opera singer.
Tell us a little bit about her. Where was she from, and how did she get into the world of opera?
Yeah, so she was born in 1868 in Virginia, and her father was a minister. And so he got a position in Providence, Rhode Island. And so she went there when she was 6. And in Providence, people saw, heard her singing and said, you got to get this woman some professional work. And so she actually was invited in the 1880s to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, where she got her opera training. And by the early 1890s, she's gracing the stage of Madison, the new, at the time, Madison Square Garden. She sung at the World Columbian Exposition, and as I mentioned, in 1892 performed in front of President Benjamin Harrison. So we're really looking at a pioneer figure.
It's interesting because she grew up in the church, and we think of so many like soul singers who grew up in the church and then became excellent in that genre of music. You don't often think about, prior to that genre of music existing, how the church could be instrumental in getting people out in front in the art form of the day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, in these fields that we don't traditionally think of African Americans in, I think that's part of why a person like Ciceretta Jones would be overlooked, right? Because people would follow the trajectory to like soul music and going back to early jazz and blues, where we really don't know much about opera. I asked my students jokingly how many had been to an opera performance, and I had like 2 of the 35. So, we're really trying to broaden everyone's minds around here. So.
I listened to Maria Callas on the drive-in today, who is white, but from Greece, and portrayed by Angelina Jolie in the new movie. It relaxed me into when it's slippery driving out there.
Can we talk about how she was received internationally as opposed to in the States? Because I know with other opera singers of her time and slightly later, like internationally is generally where they end up rising to fame instead of in the States.
Yeah, that's actually absolutely the case. I mean, she went on a huge European tour in the 1890s, and papers in the United States talked about her in Paris and Rome, and she got all these medals and these awards that she would, when she came back to the United States, would actually dawn to let everyone know that this is a person of international merit, but respected for her extraordinary voice abroad. However, with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, 1896, and things changed in the United States. And so with segregation, it really destroyed her career. It got to the point where even places like the Metropolitan Opera in New York refused to have her sing there, right? Here's this international celebrity, this black woman, but the changing mood at the time really impacted her career, and ultimately she would be compelled to move beyond opera and really sing, other types of music. And she had this sort of Black Patty troubadours. She didn't like the term Black Patty.
Talk about where that came from.
Yeah.
It was a reference to another opera singer?
It was. Adelina Patti was a really prominent European, sort of Italian singer. And because her promoter was white, and he said, look, people were sort of jokingly referring you to the Black Patty when you're in Europe. We should use that as a way to promote you. She saw it as degrading, sort of throwing, saying she's the black version of somebody else. But, at the same time, she needed to sell tickets, and her promoter, really pushed that. And then she'd go on, of course, to create, the sort of Black Patty troubadours traveling, which had all sorts of acts, again, as a way to make money, as many artists must, when, structural barriers and all sorts of barriers, in her case, are going to lead her to struggle financially.
We're speaking with Professor Usman Power Green, The Power of History, and we're focusing on Ciceretta Jones, an opera singer at the turn of the 20th century, the end of the 1800s.
Building that international renown, it's like interesting that like you had to leave the country and come back. And like Marian Anderson has the same thing happen.
Of course.
Comes back, the Met wants her, and she's like, no.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she remembers Ciceretta Jones' experience and decided. But, I do want to mention, just sort of as a side note, so she ends up after a 20-year career having having to retire to take care of her mother in Providence and then use all of her savings to take care of her mother. And I think it's a real testament to her sort of like commitment to her family and her community as opposed to her career. And sadly, in 1933, she's going to die in poverty. Right? And this is a woman who had to sell her medals in order to, again, care for her ailing mother and survive. And, just to bring it full circle, as we think about these sort of global superstars, the amount of wealth that's in the entertainment industry, to think about some of these pioneers that did such extraordinary things and were known, throughout the world in some ways, but definitely in Europe, to think about them dying in poverty and then, of course, their legacy being relatively unknown really, speaks to the need for Black History Month and the need for those of us who care about, sort of the hard road to freedom, as it's often called, people who care about those things to know and acknowledge the pioneering work of people like Sister Retta Jones.
Has the city of Providence done anything to try to remember her since she had such a connection to that city?
I'm not 100% sure, but I do know that since 2021, and this is part of the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement, is figures like this were really lifted and raised. And if someone out there from Providence, could call in and let us know, it would be wonderful to add that to the list of acknowledgments that those of us who visit Providence can maybe go check out where she lived. Maybe her home has been restored. These are things that they really kicked off for 2020.
I love Providence.
You're just trying to go on a visit.
Oh, I know.
That's fine.
Yeah, we'll go to Federal Hill, get some good Italian food. Love it. Another person that you wanted to focus on, Professor Usman Power Green, professor of history from Clark University, is somebody that I didn't know of that has a very specific distinction that you like to use as a fun party trick.
Yeah, absolutely. So
we're ruining this for like anybody who's about to who's listening who might take your class later.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, in class I just make them read it and don't read her essay, Voice from the South, and don't actually do party tricks with them.
That's fine.
So students who are listening, y'all are with me. But one of the most fascinating elements of the ways in which I think racism functions to sort of impede our knowledge is the ways in which we don't even recognize very prominent African Americans. And Sister Retta Jones is one, but the other is a woman who is in your passport. It was that prominent, and yet we don't know her. So those are at home, not y'all driving, go to your desk or those who have passports and flip through it. There'll be some observation you'll make, and I'll just sort of give it away because we don't have the patience to wait for you to all get it. But if you were to flip, you would notice that almost all of the people actually of the 1312 have quotes in the passport from men. But there's one one woman who's quoted, and the quote is, "The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity." And that quote is in your passport, and that is by Anna Julia Cooper, everyone. Run and write it down, again, if you're not driving. Anna Julia Cooper. You should know Anna Julia Cooper. She is so prominent that she is a Black woman in our U.S. passports, meaning that she's a voice that represents the United States for the work she did. But, of course, obviously, as the story often goes, my course is, she is not remembered, but also had a tough life after coming to prominence as a Black woman intellectual.
Tell us a little bit more about her and her story. When was she operating? Where is she from?
Yeah. So Anna Julia Cooper was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, 1858. So before the Civil War, and she's going to really come to prominence in the 1880s and 1890s. She attended Oberlin College in 1881, which was a pathway for a few select Black women who really had privilege in the time period. And by 1892, she publishes a book called A Voice from the South, which you could, at this point, you can download it. But A Voice from the South was a really important intellectual contribution, a collection of essays that analyzed the South during slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, and attempted, similar to the more well-known Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk, to offer, as the title is, Voice in the South, a Black woman's perspective on, racism, the outcome of slavery, the striding of African Americans, and then, of course, most importantly, the plight of women. She quoting Martin Delany, famously is known for saying, "Only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." And that quote is sort of a prominent quote attributed to her. It's one that helps clarify the crucial role of race, and gender, in our history, and particularly for Black Americans. So Cooper comes of age in the 1890s and really finds herself amongst Black intellectuals, mostly men, in that era.
I'd mentioned that you kind of use this as a party trick. Tell us how you do it. Do you usually bring her up as a name and then say she's so famous that she's in your passport?
Yeah, actually, I usually will, ask my students if they'd ever heard of this person. I'll read the quote, and it'll be an audience of students in a talk I give, say, at a high school, and 99% of the time, no one's ever heard of it. And then I'll take out my passport, and I'll show them. I'm like, it's right here in your passport. And what's the point? I mean, the point is to show that even when it comes to Black Americans who actually were so prominent and distinguished that they actually represent the United States, we as a society don't even know them, right? So if anyone ever questions Black History Month, it's like, in of itself, we are educating those that don't have the privilege to take courses on African American history or have U.S. history teachers who talk about some of these figures.
How did she balance intellectualising about her womanhood and her Blackness? Those are things that, at least at the time, were definitely looked at in separate perspectives.
Yeah.
And intersectionality is not necessarily a thing that is in the forefront of anybody's minds.
Yeah. I would actually say that she is one of the pioneering thinkers. They're really thinking about race and gender, right? So she certainly, and the question of class is going to sort of emerge, as a sort of, intersectionality. But she balanced it by, mostly putting herself in the conversation in these circles and being invited to these circles. So she's oftentimes the one or two, Mary Church Terrell's another one. These are Black club women, everybody, who are really prominent Black American women who are highly educated and who really provide like the backbeat of social reform for the Black communities, right? So she was amongst Black women organizing, but also the one or two Black women who are at these events who are constantly bringing up this question of gender with race. But she also had to balance it, by having sort of a day job, as opposed to being a professional intellectual. I mean, she was the principal of M Street School, which becomes Dunbar High School in D.C. in 1902. Her resistance to sort of having a quote-unquote colored curriculum leads them to let her go in 1906, and then end up earning her PhD in Paris at the Sorbonne, which she finished in 1925, right? So we're looking at a person that's negotiating race and gender by continuing to stand by her beliefs, continuing to demonstrate her intellectual merit, by getting a PhD later in life. And then in the 30s, she's going to become the president of Frelinghuysen, which was basically a university for Black adults in Washington, D.C., and she's going to sort of lead that until she dies at 105 in 1964.
Whoa.
Yeah, which is incredible because it's only a month before the Civil Rights Act will be passed. So she really is a person who, although becomes a little bit more behind the scenes than her earlier life, is going to be involved in conversations about racial justice well into her 80s and 90s.
Basically, her whole life covers the entire period of change.
Absolutely.
From just before the Civil War to just before the Civil Rights Act.
Absolutely. And pioneering figure who never stopped agitating for racial justice and for educational equity. Anna Julia Cooper, everybody, look her up, Google her, do whatever you do.
Or just bring out your passport.
Or
bring out your
passport, because she is a person we should definitely know.
Anna Julia Cooper and Ciceretta Jones, two women that our professor Usman Power Green wants to focus on in the power of history as we quadruple down for Black History Month. Next time we have you on, we're going to talk about a specific day, not quite a holiday, but a day of importance that none of us knew about until recently, but you are becoming more and more intimately involved with on the municipal level. Reparation Day. Thank you so much, Dr. Usman Power Green, professor of history at Clark University.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Up next, more of our school vacation history class. We'll talk with historian Eric Slocum about the importance of learning from and generating oral histories.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering co-op advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by UMass Amherst School of Public Policy. Admissions now open for graduate programs in 2025. Learn how to become a changemaker at umass.edu/SPP.
Erica Slocum is a scholar of Black history. She has worked on uncovering the history of Black people in Holyoke, Massachusetts, in conjunction with the Holyoke community, and working at Historic New England on the Recovering New England's Voices, interpreting and researching the histories of Black experience across New England.
Her research, Reliquary of Blackness, focuses on the use of archival research, oral histories, and community storytelling to retell, reshape, and reclaim history in spaces where Black stories have been obscured, specifically reclaiming the narratives of Blackness in museums and other repositories of history and culture.
Erica is currently the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford and a PhD candidate at UMass Amherst, and here with us to talk about the importance of oral histories. Thank you so much for joining us, Erica.
Thank you for having me.
We rarely delve outside of the 413, but we've done it several times for you and
She's a
for the
PhD
Stowe Center
candidate
and
in
a PhD.
Amherst.
Yeah, lots of local connections of all the excellent work you've done.
Usman Power Green doesn't teach in Western
That's
Mass.
true.
He lives in Western
he's
Mass.
in Worcester.
And we talk to
Clark.
him every month.
That's true. That is true. So with historians, we make these wonderful exceptions for really good
Because
reasons.
the reach of history is long. So talk a little bit about the importance of getting oral history and how that's impacted some of the ways that you go about in your projects.
So first, I'm going to take us back in time.
Oh,
Right? So some of the first American literary activists are enslaved and formerly enslaved Black folks. A number of them, because of the nature of American education and American law, says that these folks can't be educated, right? So they can't learn to read and write. And as we know, there are people like, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs who work towards teaching themselves how to write. They're in spaces where they learn how to read and write and are able to write their own narratives. But before that, or in conjunction with that, you have folks who aren't literate. And so the way that they're passing their story is orally. In the Black community, we have a large tradition of oral histories, oral storytelling. And so I think that for me, it's important for us to continue that tradition, right? For us to talk to our elders and to talk to the youth as well, to get a perspective of what is life intergenerationally.
So there are a group of people who don't necessarily have the same access to written word, and therefore oral tradition and retelling of their story is the only way that we have access. But then how do those oral histories fit into the larger narrative of what's kept?
I think the importance of people being able to just tell their story. And so I think one of the things that I saw in Holyoke is that there are a number of people who will say, I was just living my life. They never wrote things down. They weren't doing, Dear Diary, today we marched on Washington. You know what I mean? They were living the experience. They were living in the time that they were experiencing life. And so I think the importance for us to be able to, for me especially, growing up, I always sat with, my grandmother and my grandmother's friends and just listened to them tell me about what they're doing now, but also listen to them, tell me about what they had done in the past, right? And these are folks whose stories weren't written down. These are folks whose stories still today aren't written down. And for me, I think the biggest part of being able to do this oral history work is that in a comfortable situation, in a way that makes sense for people, they are able to recount and relay the life that they've lived, even in ways that most folks will say, well, that's kind of insignificant. Or as I've heard people say in my oral history interviews, of we were just living life, you know what I mean? But it's well, tell me what your life is like. History happens, it's not linear, but history happens and we're living in this moment and we're not thinking about the things that we do as being history. We don't have the opportunity, I've had the opportunity a lot, especially, on the Fabulous 413 to talk to y'all about the things that I'm doing, right? And the life that I'm living and the work that I'm doing. But I think so many people don't have that opportunity, right? They wake up, they go to work, they do whatever they think they need to be able to thrive or survive. And I think having the opportunity to do real oral history interviews, right, to have the opportunity to just sit with people, have the framework and have the questions that I want to ask, but to let their stories take its own journey, right? When you zoom out and you see all the connections to the reports in the newspaper, the history that has been written down and documented, and you find those gaps too, where it's okay, so how do we get from point A to point B. And sometimes someone else's story comes in and you're like, there it is.
We're speaking with historian Erica Slocum, who has a bunch of interesting oral histories that you have been a part of, some of which we've talked about the show, the history of Holyoke. There's more forthcoming that we'll talk about perhaps some hidden histories of the LGBTQ community in Northampton. But you are also the director of interpretation and visitor experience at the Stowe Center in Hartford. And I'm imagining with the director of interpretation that oral history comes into that as well, as people are wrestling with Harriet Beecher Stowe, with Uncle Tom's Cabin, her landmark work, I guess. How does your work as an oral historian play into your job at the Stowe Center?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we have these moments where we can't go back in time, right? Like I can't sit down with Josiah Henson and say, tell me more about what was happening. Tell me more about your thought process. But again, the beauty of being able to read freedom narratives is that so often folks documented what was happening. Folks documented what their thought process was. And so I think we're consistently going back to like 19th century America, I think 19th century the world. Like folks were, their medium was, newspapers and letter writing. And so we get to go behind the scenes of like, yes, there's this Frederick Douglass that everybody knows and everybody sees. And then there's this Frederick Douglass that is a father and a husband and a member of the church and, the editor of a newspaper who has friends and has a life. And so we're able to, in the way that we can't do, again, sit down and talk with him, we're able to read his words that, like his uncensored, unfiltered words through his letters, right? In the same way of understanding Stowe, we're able to look back at her thought process and what she thought she did and what her intent was, and to be able to see that cross between all of those things and also what people in her time were able to see. Here's where she's having her success. Here's how she's helping us. And also here's how she's failing us. I think at the Stowe Center, the big thing that we try to do is, Karen Fisk, our executive director, always says, give her due, nothing more and nothing less, right? It's not about villainizing or hero worshiping. It's about humanizing. And so I think that in this time when we don't have the opportunity to sit down again and talk with them, it's like we are able to look at the full scope of who they said they were, who they were unfiltered, and to present that.
There are definitely folks who dictated their story to others when they were illiterate and then learned literacy and are able to then give those stories on paper themselves. Do you see a shift in either tone or subject matter or portrayal in those people whose stories were told in other people's words and then their own?
So, okay, I'm going to give you two examples.
Okay.
So the first is the WPA. I don't remember what that stands for.
The Works Project Administration.
Thank you. Look at Monty coming through.
I read a little bit of history myself.
So
a program of the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yes.
Also, acronyms are hard.
Yes, they are.
Acronyms
They sure
are hard.
Yeah.
And remembering them all is crazy. So when the WPA goes out and they're interviewing formerly enslaved people, particularly in the South, but all over the country, one of the things that was noted was when white interviewers went out and they would ask Black folks, what was your experience? Tell me more. They were seeing overwhelmingly that, Black folks weren't, they said, oh, well, they seemed happy, right? Like, it didn't seem like it was that bad. And when Black interviewers were going out and they were speaking with Black folks about their experience, Black folks were like, yeah, no, let me tell you about it, right? And so you were getting the reality of the situation. And so I think that it's just interesting to see that when folks are talking to specific interviewers, the way that they're presenting their experience is different. So that's one. But also thinking about if I'm an interviewer who is particularly uncomfortable with the subject matter, am I shifting the narrative to kind of fit into what I already think is the story that I know? I always approach this work by learning as much of the history of a place and space or people that I can, before I do the interview, so I have a frame of reference of like when they're talking about a street or a building or a school or even a movement that happened, that I have a basic understanding of what they're talking about. But I try as much as I can to remove myself from the story so that as they're telling me the history from their perspective, it's like the first time that I'm hearing it. And I think that everyone's not like that, but I also know that there are instances in specific cases where we see that it's documented and we know what's happening. Because even with the WPA, they're looking at particular people and then going back to particular people and saying, okay, now can you tell me, this Black woman or this Black man, the story of your experience, right? So we see that it does happen, that the tone shifts, because these are also still people who have to live in that environment. There's fear of being like, if I tell you the truth, if I tell this white man the truth about my experience, then what will happen to me? When the other white folks in the community, right, we're still talking about the rise of Jim Crow. So there's this fear of what can happen to me. The other instance, I love Harriet Jacobs, right? Because Harriet Jacobs, who is literate, she's not dictating her story to anyone. She's writing it down for herself. Harriet Jacobs is a Black woman who was enslaved. She self-emancipates. She actually hides in an attic for 3 feet by 7 feet by 9 feet. Garret is what we call it. So a slanted, attic space. She hides there for 7 years. When she finally leaves, and she does this, one, to protect herself from violence, right? Physical, mental, and sexual violence that was happening to her, and also to protect her children. And then she flees and she goes north, I believe, to Rochester. And so when she gets to Rochester, she meets a woman, Lydia Childs, who helps her to write her narrative, but only helps her in the sense that her and Amy Post, who are white abolitionists, white women abolitionists, who are like, this story needs to be told. And so how do we go about doing this? How do we go about getting you published? How do we go about making your story as approachable and as tangible for white audiences as possible, including but not limited to sending a manuscript to Harriet Beecher Stowe and saying, hey, can you help get this published? And Harriet does some messy things with that, because she ends up sending it to, Jacobs was employed by white folks. Harriet sends a letter to her employer and says, hey, so I read this thing by this woman who's employed by you. And again, at this time, legally, Harriet Jacobs is not free. And Stowe doesn't know if Jacobs has let her employers know what her situation is, right? Or anything about her background and her history. So she names names and she tells stories. And Stowe sends this to her employer and says, hey, is this accurate? Is this real? Is she telling the truth, right? And it's like, it has all of these implications and potential consequences, right? She could have lost her job. We're talking the
Fugitive Slave Act is still in action.
Alive,
like, she could be
and well.
caught
She
and
could
sent
be
back.
Yep. And so there are all these implications for her life that Stowe, well-meaning as she may or may not have been, it could have had real consequences.
She puts her into jeopardy.
Life. Yeah, she does. But the thing that's interesting about Jacobs is that when Jacobs, who publishes her incidents of a slave girl under the name Linda Brent, so she uses a pseudonym, again, to, protect herself, she says when Lydia Marie Childs and Amy Post are trying to reconstruct the manuscript, and so they're like moving parts around and they're, trying to make it more palatable, Jacob says, no, I want to publish it just like this. I don't want to, start this story over here. It's not real. You know what I mean? It's not, that's not the way things happen. And so I want to tell you how things happen. I want to tell you how I had children with this white man who was, his family is wealthy. He's in politics. I believe he was a lawyer. And so she intentionally has agency, intentionally has a sexual relationship with this man. And she has her children because it not only protects her from the sexual violence that she was facing from the man who was enslaving her, it also then protects her children because this man is like, these are my children. And however he looks at it and however that whole situation was manipulated after Jacobs leaves or self-emancipates and when things are happening, she's like, I need people to understand that I had agency. I did this in the way that I did it intentionally. I was facing this violence, and here's what I did. And so I think that when you ask the question of the dictation and folks writing it for themselves, I think that there is some control, right? There's a lot of agency that Black folks have in writing their stories. And also there are these moments of abolitionists, again, well-meaning white folks who are like, here's the way you do it so that it can be published. Here's the way you do it so that it reaches a broader audience. And again, I think in some accounts, we know that things were changed to make it palatable, and not to say that there were lies that were told. There were things that were taken out and things that were, moved around so that, again, that the story reached a broader audience.
Erica Slocum, thanks as always. Erica is the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford, a PhD candidate at UMass Amherst, and one of the archivists behind another project we're going to talk about on the air very soon. That's very exciting. Thanks so much.
Thank you for bringing me back and letting me talk.
Every time.
I love it. I don't know if you know, but I love to talk.
Every time. You're listening to The Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM. On the next Fabulous 413, we'll hear more about the Slavery North Initiative with the director of that initiative, Provost Professor of Art History at UMass Amherst, Charmaine Nelson.
And keeping it UMassy, we'll preview UMass's Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival with the theme Documenting Dissent, with guest curator Jim Hicks and the director and producer of the opening film, Borderlands, The Line Within, Pamela Yates and Paco de Onis. I'm Monty Belmonte.
I'm Khalees Smith. We'll see you next time on the Fabulous 413.